the last lecture, we described the first human settlement of Asia, the radiation of Homo erectus out of tropical Africa sometime between 1.8 and 700,000 years ago. In this lecture, we're going to move north. We're going to have a look at Europe and the first settlement of Central and Western Europe, which is thought to have occurred somewhere around 800,000 years ago or so. The date is extremely controversial. First, we're going to describe some very early fossils which come from Georgia and Israel, which are thought to date between 1.7 and 1.4 million years ago, respectively. One of these sites is controversial, the other one better established. Then we'll discuss the first settlement of Western Europe, the earliest fossils there dating, as I said, to about 800,000 years ago. As part of this process, we'll describe 3 sites which reveal something of the lifeway of the very earliest Europeans: Boxgrove, Schoningen, and Torralba. Then we'll describe the highly diverse European fossils which were the ancestors of the Neanderthals, whom we'll describe in Lecture 6, the next lecture. And I'm going to argue that the first Europeans lived a highly flexible and very mobile lifeway. And then finally, we'll discuss the cognitive and linguistic abilities of early Europeans and conclude that they were no match for those of modern humans. The more northerly, temperate latitudes of Europe and Eurasia must have been a more formidable challenge for archaic humans, especially during glacial episodes. These were periods when much of northern Europe was mantled with huge ice sheets, and enormous glaciers and ice sheets surrounded the Alps and Pyrenees mountains between France and Spain. Nevertheless, the first Europeans, Homo erectus, ranged widely in search of food and sometimes traveled quite far north. But exactly when they first arrived is a matter of debate. As far as we know, and I stress, as far as we know, things could literally change overnight with a new discovery. No Homo habilis populations arrived in Europe and moved out of Africa before 2 million years ago. The first humans to enter Europe appear to have been Homo erectus. What then is the first evidence for human settlement? One site comes from Georgia. Georgia in Eurasia, not Georgia in the United States. From a location called Dmanisi, where fragments of male and female skulls of what appears to be Homo erectus have been found with crude choppers and stone flakes. The skull fragments came from river deposits, dated by argon isotopes and by paleomagnetism, and again I refer you to the guide for details on dating methods, to somewhere around 1.7 million years ago. This is very early. The dates are somewhat controversial, and the context of the finds is somewhat of a matter of debate. But it is possible that there were humans as far north as Georgia and Eurasia as early as 1.7 million. In other words, they got pretty far north after humans first radiated out of Africa. These first Eurasians appear to predate the first Western Europeans by at least 500,000 years. Personally, I'm a little suspicious of the Dmanisi finds. I have a suspicion they may turn out to be somewhat later, but I would be glad to be proved wrong. There's another find of great interest, which is very early, this time from Ubadia in Israel. Here, some stone tools and very fragmentary human remains date to about 1.4 million years ago. This find, like Dmanisi, predates the first settlement of the West. But there's a point about Obadiah which is different. In a future lecture, we're going to look at the origins of modern humans. And we'll find that anatomically modern human beings were living in Southwest Asia, in the area of Obadiah, alongside Neanderthals, as early as 90,000 years ago. It was as if Africa and Southwest Asia were part of a similar province, and it may well be that the same was happening much earlier, and that people pushed northwards and westwards very much later. We simply, at this point, don't know. Judging from the settlement of Europe by modern humans very, very much later, around 45 to 50,000 years ago, the first settlement of what is now temperate Central and Western Europe probably came from during a period of warmer interglacial climate, as a result of the movement of people northward from warmer regions. Basically, there were two routes by which people could have entered Europe. The one is from Southwest Asia into Turkey and across what is now the Dardanelles, into Bulgaria and Southeast Europe, and then across from there into the center and the west. This route is entirely feasible, especially during a period of lower sea level during a glaciation. The other route is across the Straits of Gibraltar. Deep water, fast-flowing tides and currents. And this route seems to me less likely, because it appears that humans first developed effective watercraft very, very much later. Of course, someone may have drifted across on a raft or on a tree trunk, but this is very different from getting a founder population across, which is a much larger number of people. What we're looking at here, then, is probably a settlement of Europe across the Dardanelles. When? Probably around 800,000 years ago, although some scientists argue on the basis of controversial sites for a much earlier date, around 1 million years ago. But whatever the date, it was a settlement of momentous importance. It was not a deliberate migration. Some people living in Turkey didn't one day wake up and say, "Good morning, we're going to Europe today." It was not a deliberate movement, just as the first settlement of the Americas, much, much later, was not a deliberate movement. It was part of the ebb and flow of hunter-gatherer existence. A family, a son might split off from his father's family and move into a neighboring valley. The wide-ranging, highly mobile existence at the time meant that people would cover large distances, and that such expansions, theoretically at any rate, could happen very quickly. What dictated it were the age-old factors, the seasons of plant foods, the movements of migratory game, the endless movement from summer to winter pasture of gregarious animals like reindeer, for example. These were the factors that meant that humans moved over large distances. And at some point, maybe around 800,000 years ago, they moved into Europe. Here, as everywhere, it is a patchwork of archaeological sites which give us the picture. The earliest solidly documented archaeological site in Europe which has yielded fossil remains is a site called Gran Dolina, which is at Atapuerca in northern Spain. It is a cave, or rather a sinkhole, from which they have recovered well-preserved remains of Homo erectus dating to about 800,000 years ago. This is an isolated find. However, there is no question that settlement was widespread by 600,000 years ago, when Acheulean hand axes appear for the first time. 200,000 years after that, in about 400,000 years ago, there's absolutely no question at all that humans were living in Europe. Thousands of hand axes have come from the Thames and the Somme, as I told you in an earlier lecture, because humans were now living in major river valleys and at strategic locations where game abounded. The issue here, as it always has been for hunter-gatherers, is to live in places, or at least anchor yourself to permanent sources of water, to places where food resources of all kinds are as predictable as is possible. For example, marshlands where grass for thatch, for houses, or for shelters exists, or where you can acquire edible roots year-round, where perhaps you can trap birds, or certainly where game comes to drink. Well, where game comes to drink is where you hunt them. We have, fortunately, an example, a 500,000-year-old example, a site called Boxgrove in southern England. Boxgrove was a very strategic site. It's a place where once, and today it was a quarry, where a shallow lake lay at the foot of a 300-foot cliff. This shallow lake appears to have been a waterhole for animals large and small, rhinoceros, bison, deer, horse, and smaller animals as well. The evidence that Homo erectus butchered these large animals is absolutely indisputable. Why? Because the bones of these animals have been found in a deposit by the lake with clear signs of cut marks from stone tools. Furthermore, they hunted some of these animals. Why? Because the shoulder blade of a horse found at the site has in it a hole, which clearly was made by a sharp-pointed spear, probably a wooden spear. It's a 2-inch hole made by microscopic examination, they tell us, by a spinning wooden spear. These guys knew how to hunt, but the art of it was very tricky. Contemplate, if you will, for the moment, hunting with just a wooden spear. What is the accurate range of a wooden spear? Probably about from me to the camera person over there, maybe 20 feet. Because you've got to hit that animal in an absolutely vital spot, or you're not going to kill it. You might wound it, but you won't kill it. So what have you got to do? You've got to get really up close and personal with that animal through your skill at stalking. Literally, you've got to jump on that animal to kill it. But with large, formidable beasts, there's only 2 other strategies that will work. One is to dig a pit and hope it will fall in. And the second one is to drive animals over cliffs. All of you are familiar with the Paleo-Indian bison kills of the plains, the famous epic bison drives. Here at Boxgrove is a cliff. At the foot of the cliff are the bones of animals by a shallow lake. It's entirely possible that here for the first time Homo erectus would drive animals over the cliff, perhaps using fire, and then when they were helplessly wounded at the bottom, would get close and kill them. How do we know they had wooden spears? How do we know there was any grounds for that 2-inch hole being a spear, apart from microscopic examination? Another find dramatically proves it. This time from an open coal mine at Schöningen in northern Germany. So many important archaeological sites are made by accident, and at this early period where you're dealing with gravels and so on from river valleys, many of these finds do come from quarries. At Schöningen, by sheer accident, a number of long wooden spears, not stone implements, but wooden spears, by the accident of preservation, survived in the Schöningen quarry. These are 400,000 years old. The spears are remarkable. They're up to 7 feet 6 inches long, with tapering tails. If you've got a tapering tail, it not only stabilizes it, but it can cause the spear to spin in midair, making it more accurate. And it seems quite possible that this was the type of long spear which was used at Broxgrove. Carefully sharpened, lethally sharp. Which raises the fascinating question once again. When did humans start hunting large game? The answer seems to have been that Homo erectus was fully capable of hunting large animals with pretty lethal spears. But whether he did this when the animals got into helplessly bogged situations, or whether he did it cold, is a matter for discussion. I think the first hunting started with Homo habilis, of smaller animals. But the bigger ones, no question, Homo erectus was the first. How do we know this? There's another piece of evidence, another site. A site called Torralba, northeast of Madrid in central Spain. A place where there's a deep, or was, a deep swampy valley about 300,000 years ago. This was an area frequented by large, now extinct elephants who were migrating, apparently, between winter and summer grazing. This site was a swamp, and a remarkable excavation showed that these animals had either been driven or had got mired in swamp and now became helpless. They were probably killed in the swamp and were then butchered, and there was plenty of evidence from Torralba of butchering. This is very solid evidence that certainly people were not afraid to hunt a helpless beast, or perhaps to drive them. We can argue that the first Europeans were eclectic and flexible hunters who relied on hunting, scavenging, and plant foods. What they did not seem to exploit was small game, birds, fish, or sea mammals, as modern humans did almost at once. It seems that people were living now in relatively large groups at times, both to reduce the danger from carnivores and to improve the chance of acquiring large animals. Cooperative hunting was a powerful weapon now in the human armory. At other times, band size may have been much smaller, especially when plant foods were more abundant. All of this argues for considerable social flexibility and intelligence in Homo erectus, reflected in the larger brain size of these people. But they may have been incapable of integrating their social intelligence, their ability to share food and cooperate in the hunt, with other aspects of human intelligence. We simply don't know. They certainly were not the sort of hunters that modern humans were, or indeed, as we shall see, that Neanderthals were. But they were certainly killing some large game. The fossil record for the first humans is as incomplete as that in Asia, but it does reflect considerable diversity. Apart from the 800,000-year-old specimens from Spain, a robust jawbone from Homo erectus, or possibly from a more evolved form, which sometimes is called archaic Homo sapiens, where there was some evolution within Europe, comes from Mauer in Germany and dates to about 500,000 years ago. A heavily built thigh bone of a human came also from Boxgrove, and that certainly is from Homo erectus and is about the same age. By 400,000 years ago, humans lived throughout Western and Central Europe. There are occasional finds of fossil skulls, which show larger brain vaults and more receding faces, foreshadowing the Neanderthals of later millennia. The Neanderthals, the epitome of the cave people, the primordial Europeans, had an ancestry among these earlier humans. Probably the most complete fossil evidence for the archaic world as a whole comes from the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain by the Gran Dolina. The Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones, a sinkhole in this area, has yielded the remains of no less than 30 to 50 individuals dating to about 300,000 years ago. Now, this is a fairly sizable population, and it represents a more advanced human form, clearly descended from Homo erectus, and intermediate to the archaic primordial Europeans, the Neanderthals, described in Lecture 6. Again, you're looking at a trend which we begin to see in Asia too, towards larger brains, more rounded skulls, and a skeletal anatomy on the limbs closely resembling that of modern humans. You're talking about people who were the ancestors of folk who were tough, nimble, and intelligent hunters who had the ability to kill animals of every size, even if the danger was extreme. Which raises an interesting question. Were these people capable of fully articulate speech? We communicate emotion and anger and pleasure and all sorts of subtlety with our speech, even if it's on the telephone. Homo erectus appears to have had a well-developed Broca's area of the brain, the zone associated with speaking ability. The vocal tracts of Homo erectus were more modern than those of Homo habilis, which suggests a considerable potential for articulate speech. Two anthropologists, Leslie Aiello and Robin Dunbar, argue that the basis for language ability appeared in humans about 250,000 years ago. They believe that this ability evolved as a way to handle increasingly complex social information. For example, if you're going to cooperate in a hunt, you need an ability to communicate clearly what your plan is, who goes where, the strategy of the stalk, the strategy of the actual driving of the animal, and the arrangement of the people who are going to kill them and butcher them. As group size increased, so did, we suspect, a capacity for language, which was used primarily to communicate about social relations. We are looking at a world where life was becoming more and more human. But this is not to say that these people developed the kind of general purpose language we use today, which enables us to communicate freely, whatever the behavioral domain, whether it be face-to-face, whether it be on the phone or with email or whatever. While like us, in many ways, Homo erectus lacked the cognitive flexibility of modern humans, yet it was from this archaic human that first more archaic Homo sapiens evolved, and ultimately, and we shall see that it was not in Europe, that ourselves, Homo sapiens sapiens, ultimately evolved. How do we know they had not got fully articulate speech? An interesting anatomical reason. The larynx had not yet shifted into the position which it is in modern humans, which allows the enormous range of sounds which Homo sapiens uses in the course of interaction on a day-by-day basis. By the end of this lecture, we will have advanced from 800,000 years ago to approximately 100 to 150,000 years ago. This is really the last of our really major jumps in time, because now the world is getting more crowded, and there are many more people interacting with one another, and the archaeological record becomes more complete and better known. If there's one rule about human prehistory, the later it is, the more we know. One reason is that once we come to modern humans, we speak. We can interact with people in the past a little more closely than we can with Homo erectus or earlier humans who were not as human as us. But in the context of today's lecture, we know that by 150,000 years ago, several thousand people lived across Western and Central Europe. We suspect, and this is logical, that most of them dwelt in large river valleys and near lakes. Why? Because we found thousands of finely made hand axes in the ancient gravels of large rivers, made by hundreds of generations of hunters to butcher game and for other purposes. And this was a world when the generations passed quickly, where you were an adult by 12 and probably dead by the age of 25, if you were lucky to survive that long. The hunters were hunted. They were predators. Because you see, the life way of people 150,000 years ago in Europe was very little different from that of 500,000 years earlier. Constant mobility, large hunting territories anchored to permanent water supplies, and probably places where food supplies were more predictable in winter. Small camps, constant ebb and flow of population. Technology was simple, versatile, highly portable, and much of it made of wood, of which we only have the smallest fragments. Survival and the hunt depended on expert stalking, on fire-strengthened, sharp spears, clubs, and possibly traps, as well as cooperative hunting. Stone tools were multi-purpose artifacts like the hand axes, used for butchery and many other purposes, cutting wood, scraping skins, grubbing for tools, for roots, perhaps even thrown sometimes at small game. Simple scrapers and flakes sufficed for the many domestic tasks, for processing hides and woodworking and other purposes. There was none of the specialized weaponry and the more sophisticated artifacts which appeared after 100,000 years ago in Europe and elsewhere. What then happened in this archaic world? On a day-to-day basis, the answer could be very simply and tritely, absolutely nothing. The rhythm of life passed from generation to generation with an ebb and flow of populations across vast, still largely unexplored landscapes. The world's population was teeny, confined to the more temperate and tropical parts of the Old World, and vast areas of the globe, notably the Americas, were still unpopulated. Humans were versatile. Humans were on the move, but they did not yet have the cognitive abilities or the technology to master the climatic extremes of the Arctic North. In this lecture, we've described the first human settlement of Europe, one of the more challenging environments colonized by archaic humans. It was occupied somewhat late, perhaps as early as 800,000 years ago. The date, as I said, is controversial. We began by describing some very early controversial fossils from Georgia and some that are less controversial from Israel, which date to between 1.7 and 1.4 million years respectively. We stressed that what we know about the human settlement of Europe in the very beginning is almost nothing and is based very largely on one fossil find in Spain. And then we described 3 sites which reveal something of the lifeway of Homo erectus: Boxgrove, Schöningen in Germany, and Torralba in Spain. We discussed the highly diverse human populations of Europe who were the ancestors of the Neanderthals described in Lecture 6. And finally, we described the cognitive and linguistic abilities of early Europeans and concluded that they were no match for those of Homo sapiens, ourselves.